gospel for today takes us right into the middle of a quite dramatic situation. Lazarus had been very ill, and then he passed away. The sisters, Martha and Mary, had sent out word to Jesus that their sick brother, that their brother was sick and how serious the situation was. But Jesus had not rushed to Jesus' side. Jesus had spent 2 more days away, and then only after the 2 days he had traveled to Bethany. And at the time when Jesus arrived, Lazarus had been dead for some days. So Martha and Mary came to Jesus with a greeting, but also with a reproach. "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." And I guess every time I read that story, and maybe you too, we wonder, why had Jesus not come? Obviously, Jesus had cared about Lazarus. He was his friend. Obviously, Mary and Martha were firm believers. No reason is given why Jesus didn't rush to his friend's help. It's hard to understand. Jesus just hadn't come. I remember vividly when I talked about this story in a Bible study group. One of the ladies immediately said, "This sentence, 'Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died,' really hits home." And everybody in the group nodded and agreed. I think many of us have said, or at least thought this sentence, something like that. "Lord, if you hadn't been here, this awful thing wouldn't have happened. My wife or my daughter would not have died. My brother, my husband would not have been in a terrible accident. My marriage wouldn't have fallen apart. Lord, why didn't you come to save me, to save him, to save her? Why did you not come when you ran to the help of so many others?" I guess this is the question that we always struggle with. Why do bad things happen to good people? We struggle with that reality, and it makes us angry, as it did make Martha and Mary angry. That question can break our hearts. "Lord, if you had been there, my brother wouldn't have died." If you had been there, we would be celebrating and not having to mourn our loved ones. As we are not told why Jesus did not come to the help of Lazarus, we don't always know why God does things the way he does. And in our lives, we just experience both. On the one hand, the many beautiful, good things about our world, the many blessings we receive every day and for which we are thankful. And on the other hand, the brokenness of our world, the injustice, the violence, the pain and the grief we feel ourselves or we see in others. Especially today, on All Saints' Day, we remember the loved ones we had to let go. Today, we bring our grief before God and we seek his comfort. We heard Isaiah's vision of the banquet that God will provide, of God's immediate presence at the end of the days, when tears will be swept away and everything will be put right and the world will be whole again. But we still live here in our very earthly lives, with all the good things, but also with all the brokenness that we experience every day. We know that God's kingdom has begun, and we see the many glimpses of it. But we are still waiting for our hopes to be completely fulfilled. We wait to see our loved ones who have passed on. We wait for the scars and wounds to feel completely healed. We wait for peace and the end of violence, the end of fear and prejudices. We wait for a closeness to God that is tangible and visible and right in front of us. As Jesus approaches Lazarus' tomb, Jesus himself is between life and death. We know that the moment he will leave Bethany, the authorities already plan how to kill him. And even though Jesus will rise again, the fact does not negate the pain, the suffering, and the dying that lies ahead of him. Now, what does Jesus do in this in-between time? The first thing we are told what Jesus does is when he stands at Lazarus' grave is that he's weeping. In our time on earth, there are tears. No matter how sure we are of God's promises and how strong our hopes are, there will be tears. Weeping is not a sign of lack of faith. Martha and Mary and Jesus wept at the pain and struggle and sorrow they experienced. Jesus knew that he had the power to raise Lazarus. He knew that Lazarus was safe in God's presence, and yet he wept. We live with hope and trust in God, but here and now, we live in the reality and the confusion and the chaos of our world, and there will be tears. But tears are not the end of the story. Jesus called Lazarus out of his grave and shows us that having a God of resurrection means that the story is seldom over when we think it is over. It shows us that God has a future for us that reaches beyond our graves. So for me, the story of Lazarus is a twofold comfort. First, it shows that God can and will create new life at the end of times, for all that have passed and for us who are still here. Our deceased have not disappeared into some black hole, but God's world embraces them and us. And the other aspect is that resurrection can happen in the middle of our lives. Lazarus has literally been called out of his grave. He came back to life. But he came back to a life on our earth, a life that was not without sorrow. He still had to deal with the ups and downs of life, and he knew that one day he would be put back into that grave. And yet, he knew he lived with the hope and the knowledge that God is stronger than death, and he can and will call me out of the grave again. So resurrection can happen in the middle of our lives. And I'm sure you and we have seen it many times. I remember a friend who thought her life was over when her husband had decided to leave her. I know parents who lost a child and thought they would never, ever be able to laugh again. I know people who have struggled with addictions and became sober. That doesn't happen from one day to the next. And there are still painful moments with that, but they are a witness that God, that Jesus can call us out of our graves. And the last thought, it's important to look at how Jesus did that. Of course, he could have raised Lazarus any way he wanted to, but he chose to ask others to roll the stone away. He chose to resurrect Lazarus with his grave clothes on, and then he asked others to help him to take them off. God seems to be like this, always looking for human cooperation in accomplishing his purpose. He doesn't have to, but he chooses to. He chooses to work through us. And we are invited to join God in his work of resurrections, to be part of his church, help roll away stones, and remove grave cloths from people who are entombed in their fear, in their loneliness, resentments, or wounds. God lets us help. For the time being, we live in hope for what is to come, at times with a heart filled with joy, and at times with a heavy heart, but always knowing that God is the one who walks with us. God is with us while we weep, we work, and we hope. And one day, we and all the saints will see him face to face. Amen. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord look upon you with favor and give you peace. Amen.